Thank you. Again, today we're going to be discussing the UC budget, the governor's proposal for 2016 and 2017, as well as some overarching issues with enrollment and costs. And I would start out by saying that there is not a member of the legislature who doesn't support the UC. We know that the work they do to provide about 50,000 bachelor's degrees every year, cutting-edge research leading to over 62 Nobel Prizes and 67 National Medals of Science. But we also have some overarching concerns that we've discussed this year and last year and frankly prior years regarding enrollment and access for Californians. We see that unfortunately we've been rationing access to Californians, especially with these out-of-state student enrollment policies for non-resident students. And it's our top priority to reverse this trend and focus more on California students. We know that we're talking about potentially a fair ratio going forward to ensure access for Californians. It was disappointing last year that roughly 20% of incoming freshmen were non-resident students. We think that's too high. We'll also have some discussions as far as costs. We know that UC has taken some cost-cutting moves, especially during the Great Recession. But we think that including pension reform last year, and certainly we appreciate that, but we think that we ought to be doing more. And we know that this is an era of limited resources and many needs, of which that grow besides higher education. And so we need to make sure we're diligent as far as looking for cost-cutting approaches as well, in addition to increased state support. So with that, let's begin our hearing today and bring up the University of California, Department of Finance, and the LAO. And the first issue we will discuss is an overarching issues on enrollment trends at the University of California. Okay, we'll begin with the University of California. Kieran?
I think the microphone is on. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for having me testify today. For this panel on enrollment, I'd like to first start with just a brief little snapshot of UC enrollment so you have some basic numbers in your mind. So we enrolled about 251,000 full-time equivalent students last academic year. That's 14-15. So we can look at the head count, the amount of students for 15-16. We don't have the finalized data on what the full-time equivalent enrollment is. But the undergraduate enrollment based on fall head count for this academic year, 15-16, is about 200,000 undergraduates and about 52,000 graduate students. So of these approximately 200,000 undergraduate students, approximately 30,000 are non-resident students. So of those 30,000, about 2/3 are international and about 1/3 are non-resident domestic students. So non-residents represent about 15.5% of our undergraduate student population. That's across the system. The Budget Act of 2015 provided that an augmentation of $25 million would be provided to UC if we were to demonstrate by May 1st that we will enroll 5,000 more undergraduate residents than we did in 14-15. So we're very confident that we will achieve this goal. On April 27th, we provided information to the Department of Finance as required by the Budget Act. And it is our understanding that the Department of Finance will soon make a determination about the information that we have submitted. So, as a reminder of where we're starting with our enrollment plan, if I could ask you to turn to page 2 of the handout, and I will credit the legislative analyst for putting together this chart. Each of the 9 campuses that have undergraduate students are going to participate in the enrollment growth. Obviously, the Berkeley, Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Diego campuses, which are the bars represented at the left-hand side there, are going to be growing the most with 750 students at each of those campuses. Again, this is over 1415 numbers as required by the Budget Act. There's significant growth at the other campuses as well. I would like to highlight that the admissions rate, which is basically the percentage of students who are offered admission out of those that applied, is about 64% for fall of 2016. That is roughly 8% increase over the admissions rate from last year. So here's basically what our plan is. We plan to enroll 5,050 more new California freshmen and transfer students. So that's basically a head count measurement, and this has to do with new students, not with the overall undergraduate enrollment population of California students. So if you turn to page 3 of the handout, you're going to see that measurement. Again, this is based on head count, and we look in the left column for 14 and 15, and we look down there, and you can see the total aggregate enrollment. And if you're to look over to 16, 17, 2 academic years, there is the increase with the difference of 5,050. So not only are we planning to ensure that we achieve the State Budget Act parameters through new freshmen and new students that are being admitted as transfer, but also to achieve an increase of more than 5,000 in new and continuing, so the overall enrollment growth. And so this is a full-time equivalent or an FTE measurement. And so these two measurements clearly are linked. And by increasing the new students, 5,050, we expect to result in an increase of approximately 4,700 in the new and continuing, but that is just for fall, winter, and spring. We're going to add to that full-time equivalent measurement an additional 400 summer session students in 2016. So that brings the total resident undergraduate FTE to over 5,100. So that clearly exceeds the 5,000.
Quick question, Mr. Flaherty.
Sir.
What about the 1,600 that you didn't enroll last year in the blip?
Yes, and so the next page does demonstrate that, well, I think it's reflected on the next page, but in short, what you're saying, Assemblyman, is that the campuses fell short in their efforts to maintain enrollment flat last year. So consequently, certain campuses have to make up the amount that they fell short from enrollment last year, in addition to the, for instance, 750 or the other target number above 1415. So there's a bit of, we've been calling it a trough, and the campuses that were short as that part of the trough will have to enroll those students plus the additional amount that I just referenced.
Okay.
Just a quick note about transfer students. If you look at page 4, you're going to see the breakdown between new freshmen and transfers. The campuses have been given separate targets for each transfers and freshmen. So in the left hand there, in the greenish columns, those are new freshmen, and in the right hand is the total new transfer head count. So if you look down into the bottom, across the bottom where it says UC, you can see in the increase over 1415 for freshmen, we're planning on 3,120. And then if you look at the far right, bottom right-hand corner for new transfer, we're planning on 1,930 additional new transfer students. So that's the largest ever one-year increase in California resident transfers that the university has ever had. And we think it's entirely achievable because there's been great increase in transfer demand. So demand is way up there. And we've also implemented a few new programs and processes to sort of ease the transfer process. So I'm fortunate to have today accompanying me our Vice Provost, Yvette Goulart, who will be available in one of the subsequent panels to talk a little bit more about that if you have interested in exploring that. So I mentioned before that we're very confident that we're going to hit the goal, and to just give you a little bit more information about enrollment, I want to just explain why we're very confident that we're going to hit that goal. So basically, first and foremost, we've built in a cushion. If we fall short in fall of 2016, we can require the campuses to enroll additional students in the winter and spring terms to ensure that we achieve that goal. So that's the first thing. We've got a cushion. Secondly, we already have some pretty compelling data that we can analyze, and that's based on the number of applications that we received. So California resident applications have increased this year to over 105,000 unduplicated. Transfer applications increased by 12%. I mentioned the increase in demand there. That transfer increase was due in part by our decision to extend the application process this year for transfers to a January deadline instead of a December deadline. So what's helpful about having the application information is that we can compare that over past years and try and figure out a yield analysis. And what we mean by that is we look at the initial admissions from the prior 2 years and compare it to those that actually ultimately enrolled, and then that gives us a rate. And so then we look at the amount of applications that we have now and apply the similar rate, the same rate, and it provides more than 5,000 enrollments. So it's predictive in that manner. Our plan also includes undergraduate enrollment targets that are 400 students higher for summer session as well. So we believe that that's another reason why we're ensured that we're going to be hitting that target. Just as a side note about summer school enrollment, because this has been a question that's been raised by the members before, there are 3 campuses that are participating in summer pilot programs. This is part of the budget framework between the university and the administration. There's 3 pilots going on, and each pilot has incentives designed to expand the number of students enrolling in the summer. So that's a very important component of something that we're working on to try and expand enrollment in summer session. Finally, I just want to say that admissions offers are made in the spring, and that by May 1, new freshman students that intend to enroll file what's called a Statement of Intent to Register, or an SIR. And for transfer students, that's a little bit later on in the process. But our preliminary SIR data, or Statement of Intent to Roll data, for fall 2016 also indicates that we're exceeding our enrollment target by about 1,500 students. So again, this is another indication that we think we're well on track. So maybe a little bit more. That excess of Statement of Intent to Register is before a phenomenon known as summer melt, which is not all the students that say they're going to register actually show up in the fall. And so even when you look at summer melt, we're a little bit over target at this point. So that's how we know we're on track. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the kind of students that are admitted. And if you turn to page 5, this is a chart that you're probably familiar with from having seen in the past. So these are enrollment numbers. These are not just admissions. These are enrollment numbers, and it represents low income, first generation to go to college, and underrepresented minority students. So in those 3 columns in that color coding there. So if you can see, the trend over the past several years since 2002 is that there's an increase in the enrollment in all 3 of these categories, steady and upward. Our admissions data for 2016 also demonstrates that this trend is very likely to continue. So once again, the trend data for 2016 is admissions, not enrollment, and it does not include transfers yet, but we think that it's predictive that this trend that you see on page 5 is going to continue. The progress is pretty significant in some aspects and less so in others, but the overall percentage of underrepresented minority students is going to grow from 25.8% to 27.7%. Again, I'm referencing admissions at this point. So we're currently admitting about half of all African American students, just under half of all African American students, and we're admitting about 60% of Latino students who applied for the fall term. The admission of first-generation and low-income students is also going to increase in 2016. Our admitted first-generation college students are at 43% of all of our admissions, and admitted students from low-income backgrounds constitute about 38% of all of our admissions. So that's up 2 percentage points over last year. So that's a snapshot of where things stand for enrollment in the 16-17 academic year. We, of course, would like to sustain expanded access to the university by partnering with the state and grow an additional 5,000 students over the following 2 years. So that would be not in this coming academic year when we're focused on that first 5,000, but in the out 2 years after that with 2,500 students per each year on average. So I'm fortunate to have with me today also as well our Associate Vice President for Undergraduate Admissions. His name is Steve Handel. He's here in the audience and can delve into some of the details if you have some questions about enrollment. But I think that sort of frames what we'd like to provide for the conversation so far.
Okay. Questions from committee members? I'll start off with a few. I want to start with the issue that we continue to discuss, and that's the non-resident student enrollment. And I think you see the question here in the agenda as well. So I guess one of the overarching things is we see the trend go higher and higher every year, and I guess the question is to what end? Does UC have a policy in mind? I know the regents 7 years ago came up with a policy and wanted to cap out-of-state enrollment at 10%, stating that anything above 10% would hurt access for Californians. And does the Office of the President or the regents, have you come up with or discussed a long-term policy regarding non-resident student enrollment?
So we have discussed it extensively. And then I would just slightly disagree with the characterization that the regents back in 2010 adopted policy. I know that's not the word you used, Assemblyman, but basically the Commission on the Future back in 2010 did look at and evaluate, and as you mentioned, they did reference a 10%, so that is absolutely correct. They did decline, however, to adopt a policy at that time, and as you also correctly stated, there is no policy from the regents on non-resident undergraduate admission at this point. So far, we've been handling the policy on a year-to-year basis. So, for instance, this year, the 3 campuses that have the largest undergraduate non-resident enrollment have been capped at the number or the percentage where they enrolled in prior year. So that is the second year for campuses UC Berkeley and UC Los Angeles, which both have the highest amount. And this is the first year for UC San Diego. So there is no specific policy that speaks to an overall ratio. The individual campuses have individual perspectives on what they think is best to contribute to the educational and cultural vitality of their campuses. So there is some variation out there. We know that campuses like Berkeley, Los Angeles, and San Diego have talked about having a comfort level with around the range where they are now, at least for the current year and for last year. So that's where things stand.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, it's a balancer every year, depending on how much money is needed. So that the amounts of non-resident enrollment that you decide is looked on student fee revenue, non-resident fee revenue, state funds, and this is somewhat of a balancer.
Certainly from a budgetary perspective, the non-resident supplemental tuition is an extraordinarily important source of revenue for our core funds. I wouldn't say I'm a little out of my league on the factors that go into overall determination of non-resident enrollment. I know there are some campuses that are pursuing non-resident enrollment because they have a relatively small percentage, and they would like to cross that threshold where they feel it's better for their student body to have exposure to international students and to students from other parts of the country. So, but as far as a budget is concerned, it is an extremely important source of revenue for us, topping over $800 million of our core funds budget.
Okay. We'll go now to Department of Finance. Oh, yes. Assemblymember Irwin.
I'm sorry also, I missed a little bit of the discussion. Obviously, we've created part of the problem by the state by not funding UC sufficiently. But I want to know historically when UC was well funded. So let's say in the 1990s. Let's look beyond the last 15 years. What has been the average out of state? So because I see 15 years ago it was at 5%, and we've basically tripled it. And so what was it before then?
Prior to that, the range, I believe, was around the 4 to 5% range. So it was pretty much stagnant at that 4 to 5% level, and it varied from campus to campus.
And has there been some switch in how administrators look at international and out-of-state students beyond funding? Like, is that why you're saying the number is going up?
Absolutely. I think there is a pedagogical concern that people have. I think there is absolutely a campus environment and ecosystem. Certainly that there's been a real push for trying to meet workforce needs, and the university is very cognizant of California's workforce needs. And California is very much a knowledge-based economy, at least from our perspective, with sciences and information technology, agricultural sciences, all at the forefront of California's economy. So we feel like that globalized perspective and students who are coming from other places and then by and large staying in California and contributing to our economy, to our tax base as entrepreneurs and innovators moving forward is very much a plus. So that is something that was absolutely in the consideration of chancellors when they would make their enrollment planning decisions. The overall needs of the state and the overall needs for their student body to be prepared for a globalized workforce.
And you're saying statistically that out-of-state students tend to stay in California? Because to me it seems that they would be less likely to stay in California. They don't have families here. They didn't go to school here. They don't have roots here. That they would be much more likely to go back to their home state.
I don't know if it's much more likely, but we do have some data about our undergraduates and our graduates as well, and where they reside after graduation. It's a little bit difficult to track. It's generally the students that continue higher education here in California that came as non-residents, for instance, would be easier to track than where they ultimately wind up and live and locate. But we do have some data that indicates, and I'd be happy to provide the specifics. I just don't think I should cite a statistic right now because I'm not sure it would be correct.
So you're saying really the number of out-of-state students is a balance between lack of state funding and what you see as the need to have more enrichment opportunities for the current students.
That's a good assessment, Assemblywoman. Those are two very primary factors.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Department of Finance.
Good morning, Maritza Urquiza with the Department of Finance. The governor's budget assumes that UC will meet the enrollment expectations set forth in the 2015 Budget Act of enrolling an additional 5,000 undergraduate resident students compared to the 14-15 enrollment levels. Therefore, the governor's budget includes the augmentation of $25 million beginning in the current year. We've been working with the UC to better understand how they plan to meet this enrollment expectation, and we can provide confirmation to you at the May revision.
Okay. Eleo.
Jason Constantoros, LAO. When we last met on this topic, there were some key pieces of data that were missing when data were provided to us. It sounds like, based on the testimony we've heard today, that some of that data are now available. So we'll have to review that data. But at this time, we can't comment one way or the other whether or not UC is on track to meet the 2016-17 target expressed in last year's budget.
Okay. As far as the overarching non-resident resident debate, we had a state audit report and hearing on that. Don't want to rehash all that, but does the LAO have any analysis on those discussions or the debate about a policy or a ratio going forward, or whether it's appropriate to continuously increase that number?
Yeah, we did look at the issue in last year's analysis, and we've recommended in the past that the state focus on resident enrollment. We still think that's the best way to ensure that UC is enrolling the number of resident students that the legislature would like them to enroll. Just focusing on non-resident students, like a numerical cap, for example, might not be sufficient, because UC could, for example, maintain the current number of non-resident students, but reduce resident enrollment. So a cap that's a percentage might get a little better at that, because it's a percent. So
a ratio
might be a little better. But generally, we still think that the best way to ensure access for residents is to set an enrollment target in the budget.
Yes, so do we. So we'll be trying to do so this year. Okay, thank you. This is informational. This is somewhat of an unorthodox hearing. I'll make the announcement now that we're going to hear these items, and then at the very end, we're going to propose a major action item related to UC funding, enrollment, and how to pay for that. So we'll continue to proceed with the next issue. Right here, issue number 2, the governor's 2016-17 budget proposal.
Maritza Urquiza with the Department of Finance. Consistent with the administration's multi-year funding plan for the UC, the governor's budget includes an augmentation of $125 million general fund for a total appropriation of $3.3 billion general fund. As part of the agreement that the governor and the UC president announced last year, the UC agreed to a series of reforms and initiatives related to community college transfer, time to degree, use of technology, and data and long-term liabilities. We are monitoring progress against the agreed upon timelines, and to date, the UC has been on track on implementing these reforms and initiatives. The administration will continue to follow these efforts. The 2015 budget included $96 million Proposition 2 funds on a one-time basis to help pay down the unfunded liability of the UC retirement plan. This is the first of 3 payments totaling $436 million in one-time Proposition 2 funds for the UC. The release of funds is contingent upon the UC region's adoption of a new pension plan that limits pensionable earnings consistent with those of PEPRA. In March, the regions adopted a pension plan consistent with that expectation. The governor's budget includes $171 million Proposition 2 funds representing the second installment of that plan. Additionally, the governor's budget includes $35 million general fund on a one-time basis for deferred maintenance and $25 million in cap and trade funds on a one-time basis for energy projects. Thank you.
Thank you. LAO?
Jason Constantoros, LAO. So a few months ago, we did present the subcommittee an overview of our recommendations regarding the governor's proposals for UC. And so I'll just touch on 3 of those recommendations again for this hearing. The first point we would make is we continue to disagree with the administration's overall budgeting approach for UC. The governor's providing unallocated base increases for UC. And we think that the budget process is really one of the few ways that the legislature can set its priorities for UC, in part because of its constitutional autonomy. So we'd recommend the legislature continue to review UC's expenditure plan under the governor's proposal to the extent that UC's expenditure plan differs from the legislature's priorities. It itemized areas in the budget, ensure that the budget this year is aligning with the legislature's priorities. In terms of UC's expenditure plan, we would note one item that raised concern for us. There's a $50 million item in there for what UC calls academic quality initiatives. UC's identified areas like hiring more faculty, increasing TA stipends, But ultimately, campuses would have discretion to allocate that funding, and we think the item could benefit from a little more detail. The second recommendation I just wanted to highlight regards enrollment. As you heard in the last item, last year's budget set a 2016-17 target, so we have 2016-17 relatively fleshed out. We'd recommend that the legislature continue to set budget year +1 enrollment targets. We think that better aligns the budget process with UC's fall admissions decisions. And so we'd recommend this year considering setting an enrollment target for 2017-18. To the extent that you'd like to grow enrollment in that year, we'd recommend appropriating the funding in trailer legislation to be released to UC in 2017-18. That would allow the funding to be released to UC in the year that they incur the expense. And then the third and final recommendation we made was that the legislature will work with UC to develop a maintenance earmark to prevent UC accruing a large maintenance backlog. We think that would set a clear message to UC that the state is prioritizing a proper maintenance of its facilities. That's my testimony. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Okay.